Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Dr. Miran, you are now recognized.
My view is that reindustrializing America is imperative not only for economic reasons, but for national security. Economists must accept that we are a nation with an economy, not merely an economy with a nation. To reindustrialize, policy must focus on making the United States the best place on earth to do business.
I'm Stephanie Flanders, head of government and economics at Bloomberg. And welcome to Trumponomics, the podcast that looks at the economic world of Donald Trump, how he's already shaped the global economy, and what on earth is going to happen next. Well, this week, we're asking just how exactly Donald Trump would like global trade and finance to operate, and how likely is he to get there? In just a few weeks, Donald Trump has turned one of the world's oldest security relationships, the Western Alliance, on its head. He's also unleashed a slew of tariff threats on China, Canada and Mexico, with more to come. At the same time, talk has intensified over a so-called Mar-a-Lago Accord to deliberately weaken the dollar through a grand international bargain. Well, at Trumponomics, we think all three of these things might be connected. And we think that because we've read a paper written in November by Stephen Miran, which first came up with the idea of that Mar-a-Lago Accord. Now, back then, Miran was a former US Treasury advisor working as a strategist in the private sector, but now he's poised to be the head of President Trump's Council of Economic Advisors. And the currency piece of that paper has been much discussed since then, especially the last couple of weeks, but not so much the grander reordering of the world trade and financial system, which is actually what the paper's mainly about, and I would have thought could be pretty appealing to Donald Trump too. So what is that new world order for trade and finance sketched out in that paper? Does it make any sense intellectually or practically? And how might it change the world if any or all of that were actually attempted? To help understand Stephen Miran's worldview and what it could mean for currencies, for the global economic order, we've got two brilliant voices, as you'd expect. Welcome back to Shawn Donnan, senior writer for economics with Bloomberg. Shawn, thanks again for joining us.
Wonderful to be here.
And Mark Sobel, the US chairman of OMFIF, which is the Official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum. He's also a former colleague of mine at the US Treasury, who always answered the toughest questions I had, and an International Monetary Fund official. He's been, I think it's fair to say, at the forefront, or certainly in the room, for international financial diplomacy for 20 years or more. Thanks very much for joining us, Mark.
A pleasure.
So, Shawn, briefly, how are security and economics interlinked in Miran and potentially Donald Trump's view of the world?
Stephen Miran's paper, which came out in November and which reads now as a kind of very good piece of job interviewing for the job he has now. The title was, How to Rebalance the Global Trading System. And it laid out this kind of sequence of events that they wanted to go through. And the first was based on a recognition that in their mind the dollar is overvalued and that's a problem for the United States and its competitiveness around the world. And they wanted to tackle that in two ways. One was to use tariffs to kind of rebalance trade, to draw more investment to the United States, to rebuild the industrial capacity here in the United States and its kind of hard industrial power in the world. But they also recognize that when you increase tariffs, you are going to inevitably cause the dollar to appreciate. That's kind of the laws of economics. Mark can walk you through that much more than I can. But they're going to end up with a stronger dollar. And as a result of that, they needed to come up with a plan to then weaken the dollar afterwards. And that's where this Mar-a-Lago Accord comes through. Everyone's focused on this Mar-a-Lago Accord. Very few people have focused on how Stephen Miran is talking about really erasing the boundary between America and how it uses its economic power and how it uses its national security power, and to get what it wants. And this is what we're seeing now. We're seeing Donald Trump use tariffs, use the threat of withdrawing security guarantees. We're seeing that play out in Ukraine. We're seeing that play out in the transatlantic relationship. There's big questions about what it might mean for the future of Taiwan. and things like that. But that's the new model. And it's all about how do you get what Donald Trump wants? How do you get to his vision of the global economy?
That is definitely the question that a lot of people in Washington are asking themselves. Mark, just on this piece, if you read the paper, what comes across very strongly is in effect this idea that America has been hugely disadvantaged by being the world's most important country. You know, that having this reserve dollar status and being the sort of linchpin also of the security system, but specifically the currency and the US financial system being at the heart of everything, has ended up forcing the currency to be overvalued and made US manufacturing less competitive, cost ordinary Americans jobs. The basic idea that the US dollar is overvalued and it has something to do with America's status in the global financial system, is that true? Would you say that adds up?
The dollar is the world's global reserve and financing currency. It is so because of the properties of the U.S. economy. We're the largest economy in the world. We have good rule of law. We've had respect for institutions. We've had kind of decent macro policies. We've got the deepest, most open, liquid capital markets in the world, etc. So that brings capital into the United States. And in that sense, it pushes up the dollar. So I do think that there is something to the idea that says that because of the attractiveness of the United States and receiving capital, that the dollar is overvalued, whatever that means.
I guess some people will have seen like the Big Mac index and things like that, which, you know, just basically it means that you're when you compare prices across countries, the US looks out of whack.
Yes, of course, there's no precise way to measure that. And I do believe that you could argue, and I think Vance has made this point, that it's a subsidy to consumer and a tax on manufacturers and whatnot. And, you know, historically, it has given rise or further impetus to protectionist tendencies in the United States, which is something that we were always dealing with at Treasury. And my big problem, however, with going where you are, is there's no reason why all countries should have current account balances or whatnot. Some countries are going to have deficits, some countries are going to have surpluses. And when you think about it, some countries with deficits, well, it's going to reflect demographics, energy endowments, strength of institutions, economic policies, etc. So the IMF has this calculation it does, and it says the current account norm of the U.S. should be a minus 2% of GDP deficit. But in fact, if you look at our deficit right now, it's pushing 4%. So 4% isn't 2%. And why is it 4 and not 2? And this gets back down to questions of just bad fiscal policy, for example. And Miran and others, they're all talking about the reserve currency or the financing currency role of the dollar causing problems. They don't talk about fiscal deficits. We have massive, irresponsible fiscal deficits these days. As far as I'm concerned, we should focus on implementing decent policies at home.
To go back a little bit on that reserve currency piece, Donald Trump has made clear he wants to keep the dollar's global reserve currency status. He's even talked about punishing countries that start talking about moving away from the dollar. But he also wants to make it weaker. Is there a sort of straightforward contradiction there? Could you force people to keep treating the dollar as a reserve currency while still making it weaker and maybe using lots of measures to support that?
Doesn't it depend on kind of how you weaken? I mean, currency markets, currencies go up and down. They go up and down all the time. But that's a different issue, let us say, than calling for devaluation, which to me implies official action to conscientiously lower the dollar. And as you mentioned, this idea of 100% tax on those who would shun the dollar. To me, I don't really understand how you can call for devaluation and 100% taxes and say that that is consistent with preserving the reserve currency role of the dollar. So I don't think that it's inconsistent to say we're going to run a decent fiscal policy, which may have the result of lowering the dollar's value. But I do think that calling for devaluation and taxes on others, and some of Miran's ideas like 100-year zero coupon bonds or taxes and fees on users, I think those are fundamentally inconsistent with the reserve currency, preserving the reserve currency role of the dollar.
Shawn, and we say this having already talked about it for 15 minutes. We don't want to get too obsessed with the details of this document, but I think it is interesting to sort of think about how Donald Trump's first few weeks has chimed with what was in that paper. There's quite a lot of areas where Miran's kind of assuming that the things that cause a lot of volatility or uncertainty, like the tariffs, will be done gradually. Well, seems to be a greater appetite for volatility and uncertainty from the administration so far in the way it's addressed that. Arguably, you could say the same on the security front. How much do you think is following the script suggested by Miran?
I think you can definitely see bits of the script in there, right? I mean, you can definitely see this broad idea of we're going to break down the barrier between national security policy and economic policy, and we're going to use one to reinforce the other and vice versa. At the same time, what we've seen is the same thing we saw during the first Trump administration, and that is a pretty chaotic policymaking, a lot of differing internal voices. We are seeing again, whether it's on tariffs, this kind of the rolling out of really aggressive tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and then within 48 hours, the kind of rolling back in a big way. And with Ukraine, a live debate playing out via leaks and Oval Office comments on what a peace deal might look like, what a minerals agreement with Ukraine might look like. I would say there is one kind of overarching aim above it all, and that is that Donald Trump wants America to be feared again. And that's his vision of power. And that applies to tariffs, that applies to national security. It's not that he wants America to be this kind of beacon on the hill of democracy and free markets and that the world kind of flocks towards. He wants to be able to dictate how the world runs, and he believes that fear is the most powerful thing to see. And we're seeing elements of that clearly in all sorts of policies that have rolled out. But beneath that kind of broad goal, it all looks pretty messy, and it's not clear that these goals kind of operate or can operate together.
Can I come back to the Miran article a little bit? And Shawn, it's obviously not a zero-sum world we live in, but to be more granular.
I think it's a zero-sum world that Donald Trump lives in, genuinely.
Well, yes. But the point I wanted to make, I want to go back to being somewhat of a pointy-head economics type, unlike you guys in this discussion. I wanted to talk more about some things I don't like about the Miran article.
Sure.
The implication is that the dollar's global role is bad for America. The French always talked about the exorbitant privileged. I believe the dollar's role is a net plus, not exorbitant. You know, we get maybe interest rates are lower. We're shielded from foreign exchange risk. We can use the dollar for geopolitical leverage via sanctions. The dollar's overvalued, but on balance, net plus. If we're trying to disrupt alliances and everything, I just don't know what is the end goal, the end vision.
Donald Trump famously approaches pretty much everything as a bargain, as about a deal, and as about the relative strength of each side in a deal. And by definition, you have most leverage in doing a deal with your strongest partners because they're the ones who are already have most to lose by damaging the relationship with you. So you could say it may be counterintuitive, but you could say it is a natural place to start if you have the deeply transactional view that Donald Trump has. And if you feel kind of fundamentally that the US shouldn't pay any price for being the strongest economy. Yes, it gets to be the reserve currency, but it should be paid for by other people. If America's the strongest and they've been clever enough to be the strongest, and by the way, are also willing to put loads of American troops at risk that other countries are not willing to put at risk in defending the free world, then why not have everyone else pay for that? It's like America's performing a service. And you make your allies, who are getting the most value out of you, pay the most. I mean, Mark, it may not be an attractive vision, but it's perfectly rational.
First of all, I have to say, I've always thought, certainly in recent decades, that Europe needed to step up more on defense. So I have no problem with that.
He's the only one who's got them to do it, though. Combination of him and Putin.
Well, I guess more Putin than him, I think. The magnitudes, the way of getting it done are very questionable. But again, if you're going to tell me that the Trump vision is to get others to pay for the U.S. security guarantee, maybe that's a vision. Of course, it seems now that they're all going their own way and rejecting the U.S., and this is going to have really harmful consequences, I think, for global relations and economics, and it's not going to make us more secure, and it's not going to make us more prosperous.
Okay, but take the reserve currency thing. The world benefits from there being a reserve currency. You know, we can denominate the cost of oil in a single currency. Everyone knows what they're talking about when they talk about $10. Why shouldn't the world pay for that? Why does America have to pay the negative of, being overvalued or whatever one might identify?
The United States benefits from that. And the last decades have been remarkable for the history of mankind and prosperity. And so the 80 years of the post-war U.S. hegemony has been nothing to sneeze at.
And it depends where you're sitting in the U.S. economy, right? As to how you benefit from the U.S. being or are hurt by the U.S. being a reserve currency. If you're a manufacturer, you can make an argument that you're hurt because your exports are less competitive as a result of a strong dollar. Although other people will point out that actually you can buy imported components in intermediate goods for cheaper as a result of a strong dollar, and that doesn't matter as much in terms of competitiveness. If you're a homeowner or you're looking to buy a home in the United States, you probably benefit from lower interest rates than you would otherwise as a result of demand for U.S. assets from overseas. Likewise, if you're an entrepreneur like Elon Musk, chances are your cost of capital growing up was lower than it might be in other places as a result of the U.S.'s reserve currency status. So the issue that we have here now is that it's the manufacturers and the protectionists who are driving the view of the dollar and its downside as a reserve currency. And, at some point that might shift again. And this gets to a bigger issue, which I think is going to last beyond Donald Trump, and that is America's power in the world and the place of the dollar in the world is based on decades of trust, right? Of building trust. It's based on legal certainty. It's based on this idea of America as a kind of having a coherent vision of the world. That's changed over the last decade, right? We've kind of flipped back and forth. We go from a big government paradigm under Joe Biden to now a small government paradigm under Donald Trump. We've gone from a kind of gentle giant view of a superpower under Joe Biden and Barack Obama to one of, the big gorilla kind of rampaging through the world under Donald Trump. And I think that issue of trust, that issue of certainty in what America is and what America wants and what America offers, that going away is perhaps more damaging to American power than any of these kind of little bits of policy that people like Stephen Miran lay out in this paper.
Okay, so there's a final chunk of things that I just want to get to, because all of this sounds a bit ephemeral and sort of we're talking about this paper and is it or is it not relevant for Donald Trump? And we've probably gone as far as we can go on that. What I'm thinking about as a result of this conversation is, okay, what we have learned about Donald Trump in the last few weeks is when he decides that he really wants something or he wants to be known for something, like finding peace in Ukraine, he will go further than anyone expected to make that happen, including being very tough on very close allies in a way that we wouldn't expect. If he decides that the next big thing he wants is a weaker dollar, then we will probably all be talking a lot more about a Mar-a-Lago Accord or some version of that. Mark, if Donald Trump woke up one morning and decided he wanted a weaker dollar as much as he wants to be known for a peace deal in Ukraine, how could he go about that? I mean, what might that look like? And would it have any chance of success?
So this week he's managed to get the dollar down by creating growth fears and undermining our longstanding relationships. I've already mentioned undermining the underpinnings of the dollar's status would be one way to do it. More to the point of what I think you're asking, obviously he can jawbone the dollar down. He's probably already done that. That's not going to be very effective. the Treasury could sell dollars and buy foreign currency. The Treasury doesn't have that many dollars, but they could mobilize the Exchange Stabilization Fund balance sheet in different ways. The Fed can print unlimited dollars. It wouldn't likely play ball, but it could be done theoretically.
Does that work when one country does it by themselves?
It's certainly less effective. I don't think that central banks and financial authorities in the G3 really think that intervention is all that effective absent fundamental policy shifts. Maybe there could be some concerted type of intervention operation these days. But again, central banks target inflation, not exchange rates.
We've already seen in the Ukraine context that he's sort of crossed a lot of lines that people didn't expect to be crossed. And it has to be said, the Ukraine invasion has caused everyone to do that. We've done things like seizing sovereign central bank reserves that we've never done before. We did that to the Russian central bank. So I'm sure at the IMF that caused a bit of headaches and head scratching, whether or not we should go there. What are the kind of out-of-the-box tools he could use to pressure other countries to collaborate, even if they didn't particularly want a weaker dollar?
I recently had to speak on this topic, and what I started focusing on is not so much currency action per se, but how to associate currency issues with trade measures. So under Obama and Trump, there were currency chapters as part of trade deals or discussions.
I didn't even know that.
So TPP made tackling currency manipulation a principal negotiating objective, and there was a kind of a side understanding in TPP before it was derailed that the finance ministers would meet and discuss these issues.
That was a trade deal that was negotiated under the Biden administration.
That was Obama.
Oh, Obama.
Obama.
That's right, yes. With Asian economies.
But now under USMCA, there was a currency chapter inside the deal. If you remember the phase one deal with China, there was a currency chapter. The Chinese just committed to doing what they were doing, but what not. So there's that. Then there was under the Trump administration, at the very end, there were currency undervaluation countervailing duties. A terrible idea as far as I'm concerned, but they did assess currency evaluation.
Could you make it harder for countries to access the central bank, the Fed's swap facilities? I don't know. There must be a range of things that the US has within its gift that are beneficial for other countries financially.
Look, my sense is he cares about the reputation of the dollar and the kind of branding of the dollar as a reserve currency. And he cares about having a vote of confidence from financial markets, whether that's currency markets or whether that's equity markets or bond markets. There's a kind of branding concern around the dollar. I think what he cares about in terms of the level of the dollar depends a little bit on who the last person he was talking to cares about. The easiest way, and Mark pointed to this, the easiest way to bring down the value of the dollar and also, by the way, the trade deficit is to have a recession in the United States. And one of the things that you've seen creep into markets in recent days is this question of whether the Trump administration is somehow intentionally trying to tank the economy through some of its policies, whether it's tariffs, whether it's immigration, whether it's the kind of austerity campaign that Elon Musk and Doge are waging on the federal government, both in terms of workforce and spending, and that somehow is all about bringing the dollar and the 10-year yield down to a level that somehow is of more advantage to the U.S. economy in the long term. That seems like a pretty destructive way to go about it. I have no evidence that this is actually what the Trump administration is thinking, but it gets to the point of the surest way to do some of the things that Stephen Miran lays out and that other people around Donald Trump lays out is to kind of attack America's place in the world and its growth at home and its broader exceptionalism.
Well, one thing I did learn from spending a few years looking at things from the other side of the journalistic divide as an official at US Treasury is people don't, even in this administration, I suspect people are not sitting plotting to try and force a US recession, but we shall see. Mark Sobel, Shawn Donnan, thank you so much. I am struck by the quote, actually, at the end of that paper by Stephen Miran. He says, there is a path by which the Trump administration can reconfigure the global trading and financial system to America's benefit, but it is narrow and will require careful planning, precise execution, and attention to steps to minimise adverse consequences. Well, we'll wait and see all of that then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Trumponomics from Bloomberg. It was hosted by me, Stephanie Flanders, and I was joined this week by Shawn Donnan and Mark Sobel. Trumponomics is produced by Summer Sadi and Moses Andam, with help from Chris Martlew and sound design by Blake Maples. Brendan Francis Newnham is our executive producer. And to help others find the show, please rate it highly and review it wherever you listen to your podcasts.